That radio has been dead for 32 years. Lieutenant Connor Hale's voice cut through the communications room with the clean edge of command, but the old man did not lower the handset. Walter Mercer stood beside the forgotten field radio, one weathered hand resting on its olive-drab casing while fluorescent light glared across rows of modern consoles. Around him, technicians watched in uneasy silence. The N/PRC-77 had no battery pack, no antenna connection, and no reason to produce anything except dust. A faded maintenance tag hung from its handle. Dead, do not use. Walter lifted the receiver closer to his ear. Static whispered against the speaker, thin as wind moving through dry grass. Connor stepped forward, polished boots striking the tile. Put it down, sir. Now. Walter's pale eyes remained fixed on nothing the others could see. His fingers, which had trembled slightly when he entered the room, became perfectly still around the handset. A soft click broke through the static. Then another. Then a third. Staff Sergeant Owen Blake looked up from his diagnostic screen. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "did you hear that?" Connor's jaw tightened. Electrical bleed. Nothing more. Every digital system in Fort Blackridge had failed 12 minutes earlier. Satellite links were frozen. Secure messaging terminals showed endless authentication loops. Backup channels returned only error codes. Yet the old field radio, abandoned on a shelf as a training relic, had just spoken 3 deliberate sounds into a room filled with equipment worth millions of dollars. Walter closed his eyes. For one suspended second, the hum of ventilation seemed to fade. He could hear rain striking canvas, a generator coughing in darkness, and a young voice calling through a storm from a place buried beneath 58 years of silence. His thumb pressed the transmission switch. "North Star 6, he said, his voice low and steady. "Lantern remains lit." No one moved. Connor stared at him with open disbelief. "What did you just say?" The radio answered with a burst of static. Beneath it came a voice, faint and broken, but unmistakably human. "North Star, authenticate." Owen rose so quickly that his chair rolled backward. One technician removed his headset. Another turned from her console, color draining from her face as a green indicator flickered to life on the dead radio. Walter spoke 5 words in a sequence no manual on the base contained. The receiver clicked once. Every frozen communications screen in the room flashed white. Then the secure telephone on Connor's desk began to ring. It was not the ordinary desk line. It was the red priority phone reserved for National Command traffic. Connor looked at the display. The confidence left his face. National Military Command Center, Pentagon. The room became so quiet that the vibration of the phone against the desk sounded like machinery. Walter slowly returned the handset to its cradle. Connor did not reach for the call. "Who are you?" he whispered. Walter looked at the ringing phone, then at the young officer who had called him confused, unauthorized, and irrelevant only minutes before. "You should answer that, Lieutenant," he said. 8 minutes earlier, Walter Mercer had walked into Fort Blackridge carrying nothing but an old Leatherfield log and a promise made to a dead friend. 8 minutes earlier, Walter Mercer had entered Fort Blackridge through the visitor processing center beneath a sky the color of brushed steel. A cold wind moved across the parking lot, lifting dust around his worn brown shoes and pressing his faded field jacket against his narrow frame. He carried an old leather logbook beneath one arm. Its corners were softened by decades of handling, and a dark water stain crossed the cover like the shadow of a forgotten map. The civilian clerk examined Walter's identification, frowned at the computer screen, and called Lieutenant Connor Hale. Connor arrived with a tablet in one hand and impatience already set across his face. He was 28, precise in every movement, and dressed as though even a loose thread might be taken as a personal failure. "Mr. Mercer, your name is not on today's access list," he said. Walter glanced toward the communications building beyond the glass doors. "Captain Ellis asked me to bring this." He tapped the logbook gently. "He passed away last month. His daughter said it belonged here." Connor barely looked at it. The base was conducting a major command exercise, and 3 inspection teams were already inside. He had no time for an old visitor carrying war stories in cracked leather. "Captain Ellis retired before I was born," Connor said. "You will need to reschedule through public affairs." Before Walter could answer, every telephone behind the processing desk rang at once. The clerk reached for one, listened, and went pale. Across the corridor, warning lights began flashing above the secure doors. Connor's tablet filled with error messages. Satellite access lost. Authentication failed. Backup network unavailable. He turned sharply and hurried toward the communications wing. Walter followed at a measured pace. "Sir, you cannot come with me," Connor said without slowing. "The problem is not outside," Walter replied. "Then it is definitely not your concern." Inside the communications room, the air was cool and bright, filled with the hum of processors and the clipped voices of technicians calling out failed systems. Staff Sergeant Owen Blake stood between two consoles, trying to restore a secure channel while 6 monitors repeated the same error code. Connor began issuing orders. New encryption cycle. Secondary satellite path. Hard reset on the backup server. Each command produced another red warning. Walter remained near the doorway, unnoticed for several seconds. He watched the screens, but he listened to the room. Beneath the alarms, cooling fans, and hurried voices came a small mechanical click from a shelf along the far wall. Walter turned his head. An olive-green field radio sat among obsolete equipment prepared for a military history display. A paper tag marked it as permanently inoperative. "Mr. Mercer," Connor snapped, finally noticing him. "You were told to remain outside." Walter took one step toward the shelf. Another click came from the radio. Owen heard it too. His eyes moved toward the old equipment, then back to Walter. "That sound," Walter said. "How long has it been doing that?" Connor blocked his path. "It has not been doing anything. That unit has been dead for 32 years. Walter's gaze remained on the radio. "No," he said softly. "Someone is trying to reach it." Connor gave a short, humorless laugh. Several technicians looked over. "You think a disconnected museum piece is receiving military traffic?" Walter opened the leather logbook. On the first page, written in faded pencil, were columns of frequencies, weather notes, and call signs that meant nothing to anyone in the room. One name had been underlined twice. North Star 6. Walter closed the book and moved past Connor before the young officer understood what he intended to do. He reached the shelf, placed his hand on the radio, and felt another click travel through the metal casing. This time, the room heard it. Connor's expression hardened. "Take your hand off that equipment." Walter lifted the handset. Static breathed into his ear, faint but deliberate, like a voice waiting beyond a great distance. His eyes narrowed. The present room seemed to fall away at its edges. "Mr. Mercer," Connor warned, stepping closer. Walter listened as 3 measured clicks passed through the dead receiver. His fingers tightened around it. "I know that signal," he whispered. Connor Hale stepped closer, his shoulders rigid beneath the fluorescent glare. "You recognize 3 clicks from a radio with no power source?" His voice carried across the room, and several technicians turned from their consoles. Walter kept the handset against his ear. The static rose and fell in slow waves, almost buried beneath the alarms. "It is not 3 clicks," he said. "It is a challenge signal." Connor looked toward Staff Sergeant Owen Blake as though expecting him to dismiss the claim. Owen examined the radio from several feet away. The battery compartment was empty. The antenna cable had been removed years earlier. Nothing about the device should have been possible. "Sir," Owen said carefully, "there could be stored charge in one of the components." Walter shook his head. "Stored charge does not keep time." Another sequence moved through the receiver. 2 short breaks. 1 long. Then silence. Walter looked toward the nearest digital terminal. Red symbols rolled across the screen as the system attempted the same. Authentication cycle again and again. "Your network is not disconnected," he said. "It is waiting for an answer." Connor gave a thin smile. "We have encryption specialists, satellite engineers, and automated diagnostic systems working this problem. You walked in carrying a notebook from half a century ago. And every one of your machines is speaking at once," Walter replied. "None of them is listening." The words landed harder than Connor expected. A few technicians lowered their eyes. Owen glanced at the looping authentication code and noticed that the pauses between attempts matched the rhythm coming from the field radio. He moved closer to his screen. "Lieutenant, the reset interval is exactly 11 seconds. "Coincidence," Connor said. "Run the secondary protocol again." A technician obeyed. The screen flashed, processed the command, and returned to the same red warning. Walter opened the leather field log on a nearby table. Pages whispered beneath his fingers. The notes inside were written in faded pencil, each line compact and disciplined. Frequencies, weather conditions, signal intervals, names reduced to call signs. Connor looked down at the pages and saw only the relic of an outdated war. "This is what you trust?" he asked. "Handwritten numbers?" Walter studied him. "I trust the person on the other end." Connor's patience broke. He reached for the handset, but Walter turned slightly, keeping it beyond his grasp. "That equipment belongs to the United States Army. So did the voice that taught me this signal." A hush spread through the room. Connor could feel control slipping from him, not because the old man had raised his voice, but because he had not. Walter's calm made every command sound smaller. Connor pulled a second handset from the shelf and held it out with open sarcasm. "Then show us. Call whoever you think is waiting. Maybe you can explain why millions of dollars in secure equipment cannot do what your museum radio can." Walter did not accept the second handset. He continued listening to the first. His thumb moved slowly toward the transmission switch. Owen stepped away from his console. "Lieutenant, perhaps we should let him finish." Connor turned on him. "You are suggesting that we hand command traffic to an unauthorized civilian?" "I am suggesting that the signal is real." The room fell silent again. Even the warning alarms seemed distant. Walter heard the pattern one final time. 3 measured breaks in the static. A door from the past, opening by inches. His breathing slowed. His hand stopped trembling. "This was never a general channel," he said. "It was built for one operation, one unit, and one answer." Connor folded his arms. And what answer would that be? Walter pressed the switch. The radio gave a low mechanical click. Every technician in the room looked toward him. Walter lifted his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a promise that had waited 58 years to be kept. "North Star 6, Walter said, his voice low and steady. Lantern remains lit. For one long second, nothing changed. The fluorescent lights still hummed. Cooling fans still pushed cold air through the room. Red warnings continued to crawl across the modern displays. Connor Hale opened his mouth, ready to dismiss the entire performance, when the dead radio answered. A burst of static rolled through the speaker, rough and uneven, followed by a voice so faint that everyone leaned closer without realizing it. "North Star, authenticate." Staff Sergeant Owen Blake stared at the empty battery compartment. One of the technicians slowly removed her headset. Connor took a step toward Walter. "Who is transmitting?" Walter did not answer him. His eyes had settled on the field log lying open beside the radio. He turned 3 pages with careful fingers, though he did not seem to read the faded writing. The sequence was already somewhere deeper than memory. It lived in the measured pauses between his breaths, in the old rhythm of duty repeated until it became instinct. The voice returned through the static. "North Star, authenticate." This time it sounded weaker, as though traveling across a distance far greater than miles. Walter pressed the transmission switch again. "November 7. Gray weather. Eastern lamp." Connor looked toward Owen. "Does that mean anything to you?" Owen shook his head, but his attention remained fixed on the digital console. The endless authentication loop had stopped. For the first time since the failure began, the system was waiting. A blank field appeared at the center of the screen. Then 5 characters entered themselves, one at a time. Owen moved closer. Nobody touched that terminal. Across the room, another monitor flickered. A green line appeared where only red warnings had been moments earlier. The old radio gave a deep mechanical click, and a small indicator lamp beneath its cracked frequency dial came alive. Its glow was weak, no brighter than a match seen through fog, but it changed the room. Connor's certainty vanished behind a hard, controlled expression. "Disconnect it," he ordered. No one moved. That was an order. Walter lifted one hand from the radio. "Do not interrupt the handshake." Connor's jaw tightened. "This is my communications center." "Then listen to what it is telling you." A technician at the far console suddenly called out. "Lieutenant, secure routing is restoring itself." Another voice followed. "Backup relay is online." Owen watched new data populate the screen. The signal was not entering through any registered satellite, ground line, or network gateway. It seemed to be moving through an emergency pathway buried so deeply in the system that the current software did not even have a name for it. On the radio, the distant voice spoke again. "Identity accepted. Hold for command." Walter released the switch. His shoulders lowered slightly, but his face remained guarded. Connor stepped beside him, and looked at the glowing indicator. What command? Walter closed the field log. The only people who knew that sequence worked far above this base. Nearly 150 miles away, inside the National Military Command Center, a dormant alert appeared on a secure monitoring station. The young duty officer on watch frowned at the words glowing across his screen. Legacy channel active. Authentication confirmed. Call sign North Star 6. He checked the system clock, then the source code, certain that an exercise file had been loaded by mistake. It had not. A sealed notification protocol, untouched for 58 years, opened automatically and began climbing the chain of command. Back at Fort Blackridge, the dead radio went silent. Then the red priority telephone on Connor's desk began to ring. The ringing telephone faded beneath another sound in Walter's mind, a slow hiss of rain striking canvas in the summer of 1968. The cold communications room disappeared. Fluorescent light became distant lightning behind heavy clouds, and the polished floor became dark ground softened by days of tropical weather. Walter was 24 again, seated inside a field relay station no larger than a storage shed. Water ran down the walls. A generator coughed behind him, losing power every few minutes. On the table sat the same model radio, its casing warm beneath his hands, its signal needle trembling near zero. 43 soldiers were scattered across several miles of dense terrain, separated from the main force by flooded roads and failing communications. Among them was a young lieutenant named Samuel Whitmore, barely out of officer training and responsible for men who had begun to believe no one could hear them. The operation was called Night Lantern, though the name never appeared on public records. Its purpose was simple on paper. Keep a narrow communications corridor open until every isolated team could reach an extraction point. In reality, nothing about that night was simple. Rain swallowed landmarks. Compass readings drifted. Aircraft could not descend without reliable coordinates. Walter sat alone at the relay table, listening through layers of static for voices that appeared and vanished like distant lights. North Star 6, this is Lantern 2, Whitmore said through the radio. His voice was young, controlled, and exhausted. We have lost the marker. Visibility is less than 50 yards. Walter unfolded a damp map beneath a shielded lamp. The ink had begun to blur, but he knew the terrain from weeks of monitoring every transmission. Turn west until the ground rises, he answered. You will find a creek bed. Follow it north for 400 yards. The generator faltered. The lamp dimmed. The signal nearly vanished. Walter switched to emergency power, but the reserve battery was already weak. He wrote each position into the leather field log, pressing hard enough for the pencil to cut grooves into the paper. One by one, he guided the separated teams toward the landing zone. He listened for breathing, hesitation, and changes in the rain that revealed where each radio operator stood. Hours passed. The relay station grew darker. At last, only Whitmore's group remained. North Star 6, the lieutenant said, his voice breaking through in fragments. Do you still have us? Walter looked at the power gauge. Less than 1 minute remained. He could have abandoned the station and carried the log to safety. Instead, he lowered his voice and answered with the words that would follow both men for the rest of their lives. North Star 6 is still here. Lantern remains lit. He redirected the final aircraft using a manual frequency no longer listed in the command book. Through the static, he heard Whitmore confirm that his men had reached the extraction point. 43 names. 43 voices accounted for. Then the generator stopped. The room became completely dark. Walter closed the field log, placed one hand on the silent radio, and waited alone for dawn. The mission report was sealed within days. The call sign was retired. Whitmore was told that the relay operator had never been identified beyond the name North Star 6. Walter never corrected the record. Back at Fort Blackridge, the red telephone continued to ring. Walter opened his eyes. His hand still rested on the old radio, and for the first time in 58 years, he knew that someone at the other end had finally remembered his voice. The red telephone rang for the 4th time before Connor Hale finally reached for it. But Colonel David Brennan's voice thundered through the room from the secure doorway. Do not touch that line. Everyone turned. The base commander entered at a fast walk, followed by 2 senior officers and a military police captain who had been summoned after Connor reported an unauthorized civilian inside the communications center. Brennan crossed the room, lifted the receiver, and listened without speaking. His posture changed almost immediately. The irritation in his face disappeared. His shoulders straightened. "Yes, sir," he said. "Fort Blackridge confirms reception." Connor looked from the colonel to Walter, struggling to understand how a dead field radio had brought National Command Authority onto his desk. Owen Blake returned to his terminal and entered the phrase Walter had spoken. "Lantern remains lit." The system rejected his credentials, locked the screen, and opened a warning window marked Special Access Required. A second message appeared beneath it. "Query automatically forwarded." Connor saw it and stepped closer. "Sergeant, what did you search?" "The authentication phrase." "Close it." "I cannot." The screen darkened, then displayed a single line. "Record compartmented by order of the Department of Defense." Connor turned toward Walter. "You accessed a protected channel without authorization. Until we know how, you are not leaving this room." The military police captain shifted uncertainly near the door. Walter remained beside the radio, one hand resting on the Leatherfield log. "I did not open the channel," he said. "Someone else did." "That is impossible. You have said that several times today." Owen almost looked away to hide his reaction. Connor's face hardened. "Captain, escort Mr. Mercer to the visitor holding area." The military police captain took one step forward, then stopped when Colonel Brennan raised a hand. The colonel was still listening to the secure call. "No one moves," he ordered. Nearly 150 miles away, inside the Pentagon, the legacy alert passed from a duty officer to a watch commander, then to the operations director. Each person checked the same sealed protocol and reached the same impossible conclusion. North Star 6 had authenticated on a dormant emergency channel created in 1968. The final notification reached Lieutenant General Samuel Whitmore during a morning briefing. An aide entered quietly and placed a secure tablet beside him. Whitmore glanced at the screen, then read the call sign again. The color left his face. Around the polished table, several officers stopped speaking. "Where did this originate?" he asked. "Fort Blackridge, sir." Voice. Confirmation. Partial. The system matched the phrase and sequence. Whitmore pressed a playback icon. Static filled the tablet speaker. Then Walter's voice emerged, older and rougher, but carrying the same measured calm Whitmore had heard through rain and darkness more than half a century before. North Star 6. Lantern remains lit. Whitmore stood so quickly that his chair rolled backward across the carpet. "Open a visual line to that base. Full command priority." Back at Fort Blackridge, Connor watched Colonel Brennan lower the receiver. The colonel looked directly at Walter, then at the military police captain. "Cancel the escort." Connor's jaw tightened. "Sir, with respect, we still do not know who he is." Brennan's eyes shifted to the old Leatherfield log, then returned to Walter's face. "The Pentagon does." At that moment, every secure monitor in the room went black. A new connection opened across the central display. The seal of the Department of Defense appeared, followed by 4 words that silenced every person present. "Lieutenant General Samuel Whitmore." The seal vanished, and the central display filled with a live image of Lieutenant General Samuel Whitmore standing inside a secure conference room at the Pentagon. Silver hair framed a face shaped by decades of command, but the expression he carried was not the distant authority Connor expected. It was recognition held under strict control. Colonel Brennan moved to the center of the room. "Fort Blackridge is online, sir." Whitmore did not look at him. His eyes searched the camera feed until they found Walter beside the old radio. For several seconds, the general said nothing. Walter met his gaze with the same quiet stillness he had shown everyone else. "You took your time, Lieutenant," Walter said. A faint breath escaped Whitmore, almost a laugh, almost something heavier. "I had to earn a few promotions before I could return the call." No one in the communications center moved. Connor looked toward Owen Blake, but the staff sergeant was already working at his terminal. The new Pentagon connection had temporarily granted access to a narrow section of the sealed archive. A report appeared beneath layers of security markings. Most of the page remained hidden, but several lines were visible. Operation Night Lantern. 43 personnel recovered. Emergency relay maintained beyond required evacuation window. Primary operator identification withheld. Owen scrolled lower. A final note appeared in faded digital type. "Call sign North Star 6. "Lieutenant," Owen said quietly, "you need to see this." Connor approached the screen. He read the report once, then again. It does not list his name. Because the name was sealed, Owen replied. That does not prove Mr. Mercer was the operator. Connor's voice sounded firm, but the certainty behind it had weakened. He faced Walter. Anyone with access to old records could repeat a call sign and an authentication phrase. Whitmore heard him through the open connection. His expression hardened. Lieutenant Hale, those words were never entered into any public record. They were spoken once, on a channel that failed before the transmission could be archived. Connor straightened. Sir, I am responsible for the security of this facility. Then responsibility begins with knowing when your information is incomplete. The rebuke was quiet. It carried more force than shouting could have. Walter placed the leather-filled log on the table and opened it to a page near the center. 43 names were written there in pencil. Beside each one was a time, a location, and a small check mark. Connor leaned closer. The final name was Samuel Whitmore. No check mark stood beside it. Instead, Walter had written one sentence. Confirmed aboard at dawn. Whitmore saw the page through the room camera. His composure shifted. I was told the relay station had been abandoned before sunrise, he said. Walter looked down at the old handwriting. It was supposed to be. You stayed. The channel was still open. Whitmore lowered his eyes for a moment. Around him, senior officers at the Pentagon remained silent. At Fort Blackridge, the military police captain stepped away from the doorway and removed his hand from his radio. Connor noticed the movement. His face tightened, caught between training, pride, and a truth he could no longer dismiss. Sir, he said to Whitmore, why was Mr. Mercer removed from the record? The general looked directly into the camera. He was not removed, Lieutenant. He was buried under an operation the country was not prepared to acknowledge. Whitmore adjusted his uniform jacket, then stepped back from the conference table. Colonel Brennan placed the room at attention. Brennan turned sharply. Every service member straightened. Connor followed a fraction of a second late. Whitmore raised his right hand in a formal salute. His eyes never left Walter. North Star 6, he said, this is Lantern 2. Your signal was received. Walter did not return the salute at once. He stood beside the field radio with one hand resting on the worn leather log, his face calm beneath the cold white light. Across the secure connection, Lieutenant General Samuel Whitmore held his salute without moving. The room waited. Then Walter slowly straightened his shoulders and raised his hand. Age had softened the motion, but not the precision. Lantern 2, he said, you made it home. Whitmore lowered his hand, and the officers around him followed. Colonel Brennan turned toward Walter and saluted next. One by one, every uniformed person inside the communications center did the same. Staff Sergeant Owen Blake stood rigid beside his terminal. The military police captain moved away from the doorway and came to attention. Connor Hale remained still for a fraction too long, his face caught between disbelief and shame. Then he raised his hand. Walter looked at him, not with anger, but with the steady patience of a man who had already carried heavier things. Whitmore stepped closer to the camera. Lieutenant Hale, the man standing in front of you maintained the only functioning communications link during Operation Night Lantern. When every primary system failed, he stayed at his station and guided 43 service members to safety. I was the last one on his list. Connor swallowed. Sir, I did not know. No, Whitmore replied. You did not. His voice remained controlled. But you decided what Mr. Mercer was worth before you knew anything at all. The words settled over the room. Connor lowered his salute. The confidence that had shaped every movement since Walter arrived was gone. Mr. Mercer, he said, I treated you as though you did not belong here. I questioned your service, ignored your warning, and nearly had you removed from the base. There is no excuse for that. Walter studied him for a moment. The red priority telephone was silent now. The modern systems had begun returning to life, their screens filling with stable green indicators. Yet no one looked away from the old radio. There is an explanation, Walter said. Connor lifted his eyes. You trusted the equipment because it had never failed you before. You trusted the record because you believed everything important would be inside it. Those are understandable mistakes. Connor's expression tightened. They were still mistakes. Yes, Walter said. They were. Whitmore watched from the Pentagon, his face unreadable. Colonel Brennan turned toward Connor. Lieutenant, you will submit a full report and surrender operational control pending review. Walter raised one hand. Colonel, That will not teach him what failed today. Brennan paused. What would you recommend? Walter looked toward the rows of consoles, then at the field radio with its weak green lamp. Let him keep his position. Connor stared at him. Sir, but add one responsibility, Walter continued. He learns every backup system on this base, including the ones without a screen. Then he teaches them to everyone under his command. Owen glanced at Connor, surprised. Whitmore's expression softened. That sounds familiar, he said. Walter closed the logbook. A good signal officer does not punish silence. He learns why the message did not get through. Connor stood straighter, though his eyes remained lowered. I will do it. Walter looked at him. You will listen first. The old radio clicked once more. This time, Connor was the first person in the room to turn toward it. The radio clicked again, followed by a thin stream of static. Connor Hale stepped toward it before anyone else could move. He did not touch the handset immediately. Instead, he looked at Walter. What do I listen for? Walter placed the leather field log beside the radio and opened it to a blank page near the back. Not the noise, he said. The pattern inside it. Connor lowered himself into the chair. The room had changed around him. An hour earlier, he had stood at the center of it as though rank and technology made every answer his to command. Now he sat before a machine older than his career, listening with the patience he had mistaken for weakness. The static rose. A short break followed. Then 2 longer pauses. Connor glanced toward Walter, but the old man gave him nothing. Again, Connor said quietly. The signal repeated. This time, Connor heard the spacing. It is requesting confirmation. Walter nodded once. Then confirm. Connor lifted the handset. His first response came too quickly, and the radio remained silent. He took a breath and tried again, leaving room between the words. The green indicator brightened. Staff Sergeant Owen Blake watched the restored digital systems, then the old radio, understanding that the lesson had never been about choosing one generation over another. It was about knowing what remained when the preferred system failed. On the central display, Lieutenant General Samuel Whitmore remained connected from the Pentagon. Colonel Brennan, he said, I want Fort Blackridge to establish an analog readiness program. Mr. Mercer's field log will serve as the foundation, provided he agrees. Brennan looked toward Walter. The base would be honored. Walter ran his thumb across the worn cover. Captain Ellis had kept the log safe for decades, waiting for the day it might become useful again. Walter had come only to return it. He had not expected anyone to care what its pages contained. It belongs to the people who still need it, he said. Connor looked up from the radio. Would you teach us? Walter studied the young lieutenant. The arrogance was gone, but not his ability. That mattered. I will teach you how to begin, Walter replied. The rest depends on whether you keep listening after I leave. 3 weeks later, the obsolete equipment room became the busiest classroom on the base. Young signal officers learned manual frequency control, field notation, and emergency authentication. Without automated prompts, Connor attended every session. He arrived early, took notes by hand, and never interrupted Walter when the old veteran paused to listen. The paper tag marked dead was removed from the field radio. In its place, Owen mounted a small brass plate bearing 2 words, North Star 6. On Walter's final afternoon at Fort Blackridge, Colonel Brennan offered to hold a formal ceremony. Walter declined. There were no speeches, no press cameras, and no polished stage. Only the communications team stood near the doorway as he buttoned his faded jacket and placed the now empty leather case beneath his arm. Connor walked with him to the entrance. Cold wind moved across the base, carrying the distant hum of vehicles and the steady rhythm of training beyond the fence. Mr. Mercer, Connor said, I thought respect came with knowing who someone was. Walter looked across the gray afternoon. Respect should come before that. He continued toward the visitor gate without looking back. Inside the communications room, the field radio crackled unexpectedly. A young technician froze, unsure whether the sound was interference. Connor crossed the room, sat beside the set, and waited. 3 measured clicks passed through the speaker. He lifted the handset only after the final pause. Fort Blackridge receiving, he said. Your signal is not lost. Outside, Walter heard nothing but the wind, yet a faint smile touched his face. The forgotten are not always gone. Sometimes, the world simply stopped listening.